Welcome to Omori, an RPG Maker title from late 2020, and also potentially a video game that is a little difficult for me to talk objectively about. You don't even have to dig that deep to find that I am pretty much a dedicated fangirl of this game. I have made entire Pinterest boards worth of pretty much just Omori art, I still have a full Let's Play up on my channel, and there is still a bunch of public footage available of me crying like an absolute child to this game, once even being in a, and I promise I'm not lying, try not to cry challenge. So to say that I love Omori is probably, if anything, an understatement. And yet, despite of that, then there's something about it that kind of nags at my brain. That, when I look at the review scores, makes me feel ever so slightly insane. Because even though I love this game, then I'm also almost 100% certain that it is a clumsy mess. That it almost shoots itself in the foot with one too many fundamental problems, and that its ending is a crazy gamble that the developers only barely get away with. These are but the tip of the conflicted feelings that I have with this game, and that we're going to be spending most of this video talking about. But before we can begin to take a proper deep dive into my experience with Omori and evaluate it as a story and as something I have thought about obsessively for the last 3 years, then we actually have to start somewhere that looks like a beginning, and at the very least to mention what Omori even is. So here we go. Let's actually talk about Omori, a video game that damn near broke my brain. Omori boots up not unlike many other cutesy RPGs out there, with a bunch of content warnings. Before we're met with a boy lying in the middle of the floor of a place called White Space. This is actually the game's namesake and our protagonist, Omori. A very quiet kid with a concerning lack of expression, at least almost as concerning as his liking to knives, as we have to pick one up before we're even allowed to leave this weird monochrome hell. However, as soon as we do, we're met with something very different outside. Neon and crayon, almost like something straight out of a kid's fever dream. A place that's filled with fantasy landscapes and funky creatures, but most importantly, also all of Omori's childhood friends. Featuring Kel, the living it easy knucklehead, Aubrey the tomboy with kind of a short fuse, Hiro, who is Kel's kind, sweethearted older brother, Mari, who is Omori's loving older sister, and finally Basil, the sweet photographer flower boy, whose photo album holds all the memories that this friend group has made throughout the years. And it's actually by taking a look at this photo album that we as the player get our very first look into just how close this friend group is, with scenes of fun, teasing, caring, and even love being shown all over these very adorable stills. Their individual roles in the friend group are also actually very well reflected by their role in gameplay, with Hiro functioning sort of as the party support, cooking delicious meals for everyone in the party, while of course Kel, Aubrey, and Sunny are all being small rascals beating up the enemy up front. Basil isn't too much in the fight, since he's usually, you know, the damsel in distress who needs saving. And Mari doesn't really enjoy fighting, so she doesn't follow your party directly. But you can always find her back at her adorable lunch basket, where in between beating up bullies, you can go back, have a picnic, and have it all function as this incredibly sweet save point. Generally, then playing this prologue so far is an absolute joy. It's a bit slow every now and again, but it does give you a very good idea of just the kind of ironclad friendship these kids have with one another. However, even the best of friends still tussle every now and again, and on the way to Basil's house, trouble breaks out between the two usual suspects, Aubrey and Kel, ending up with Basil and his photos getting caught in the crossfire and receiving a big old shove. Luckily, it was just an accidental push, no harm done. But when you try to help Basil reorganize the mess made of his Polaroids, then he discovers something odd. Honestly, it does kind of amaze me that I know several people who were surprised when they found out that Omori was a horror game. You know, despite the Steam tags, the never mind. This waking nightmare sequence that happens at the very end of the prologue finally reveals what Omori's premise actually is. Until this day, I still remember the unease, but also the curiosity it left me with. It's here we learn a lot of crucial information, such as that Omori, the game's supposed namesake, isn't just some boy in a fantasy setting, but actually the dream alter ego of a real boy called Sunny. That the friends we see in the dream are actually Sunny's real friends, but that due to isolation, he hasn't spoken to any of them in years, with the chance of being able to reconnect with them slipping away as his family has to move in 3 days. And all that I as a player could really do in this sequence was just helplessly watch Sunny as he maneuvered around his own house, completely terrified. His mind riddled with such restricting anxiety that he finds himself unable to do almost anything until he eventually gives up and resorts to the one comfort that he knows, which is escaping into his dreams into a place called Headspace to forget and hide from trauma that even he himself barely remembers. The reason I love this segment is because after an hour of funny, quirky RPG time, this part flips everything we know on its head. And even though it isn't a very surprising twist to most of us, then I was still positively shocked by how well it was executed, as it left me with just enough questions and mystery for me to develop this urge to uncover more and learn more about Sunny himself. But then I didn't really get to do that. After finally drifting to sleep, we find ourselves back in the magical wonderland of Headspace. But now with the objective of going to the moon in order to just cover ground and desperately try to find out where the heck Basil went. And I genuinely really liked this, because now it seemed like even though we were in the dream world, then the game was gonna go along with my newfound sense of urgency for the plot. Or at least it felt that way, for a short while. Because after a while, I realized that I had done nothing Basil related for an hour. I had been rustling space bunnies. I had been covering garbage patches and fighting interdimensional Windows 98 turnips. And then on top of that, I've been helping some guy called Space Pants Captain recover from a heartbreak by finding him his trashy breakup mixtape. In fact, if you are the type of person who just really enjoys watching the party, bicker over these tiny issues and have good times together, then you're likely completely content with everything you saw in this chapter. However, if you are a bit like me, then you kinda go through this chapter feeling like something is missing. Like the game seemed to be going somewhere with the main plot, until it just suddenly wasn't. There are several parts in this chapter that seem to build on the shock and the curiosity that we got from the nightmare segment. Parts that practically screamed at me, don't fall for the cutesy looks. This is truly a horror game. But then the horror bits end up just being kind of Easter eggs. So that just left me kind of wondering, what am I really supposed to care about here? However, I did eventually end up letting this slide. After all, Omori is a bit of a longer game, so it wouldn't be too unusual if it did need some time to get the ball rolling. So essentially hoping that this would all resolve itself as I played more of the game, then I decided to move on. And as I reached the end of the chapter with yet another dark creepy moment almost symbolizing Sunny coming back to consciousness, then I was surprised to see that Sunny was woken up by a loud knocking at his door. A knocking that would lead us into the very first daytime chapter. When you finally decide to open the door, you're met by none other than Kel, who's been genuinely trying to get a hold of Sunny ever since he heard that he was moving. And desperately wanting to get the band together like the good old days, Kel ecstatically drags Sunny out on adventures with him, exploring their old childhood neighborhood together. And honestly, except for the fact that Kel is taller now, then he seems very much like the same old goofball that we've known him as in the dream. The impulsive guy who's never really good at reading the room, but who is still a kind-hearted soul who tries his best. However, it doesn't take much adventuring around the old town before Sunny learns that time has treated his old pals very differently. We learn that Hiro, being a 19-year-old now, is actually off to college and doesn't really come around town much anymore. But we also learn, way more shockingly, that the ever-fragile and lovable flower boy Basil is actually a bullying victim of none other than Aubrey. We learn that his photo album was stolen by her, and it's in a big confrontation with her in the middle of this filled church. When Kel yells that Mari would hate to see her act this way, that we get a cold splash of reality tossed in our face, as we're told to stop preaching about what Mari would think. Because Mari, Sunny's lovable big sister, right before a big, stressful music recital with her younger brother, passed away at her own hands. I admit, I was definitely later to catching this than others, especially considering the amount of hints that yes, I know the game throws at you. But when I heard this line in that church, with this group of friends torn apart in front of me, I felt like the curtain had finally been drawn back on what this game is truly about. I felt in my heart that this game had to be about a group of friends, each and together hopefully learning to deal with the terrible reality of having lost someone they all love. And it's an assumption the game plays into very well. The incredible writers of Omori did such a good job with the switch from the dream world to the daytime world, depicting how complex and painful it is. As I got to feel that jarring difference between the dream that Sunny so desperately just wants to hide and stay in, and the raw reality that awaits him when he wakes up. A place with no low fantasy stakes. He and most of his friends are now 17, not 12 anymore. And they all turn out to be dealing with very real trauma. Something we only begin to understand more of as we dive deeper into the daytime chapters. After the loss of Mari, Kel tried desperately to keep himself and what he knew afloat. He tried to focus on something else. He tried to focus on sports. He tried to hold the friend group together as what he remembered it as. He tried to stay positive. The latter of which he was likely only even able to do because he still had his older brother. And out of everyone in this group, then he was likely the least emotionally dependent on Mari being around for him. Hiro's story also turns out to be somber and sad, but in this very heartbreakingly realistic way. The first time you see him again, he's this handsome, now grown-up college student. And much like Kel, then he maintains a lot of that personality we've gotten so familiar with, him being the big, kind, protective older brother. But the more time we spend with him, the more peaks we get under this cheerful facade, we start to learn a different story. After the loss of Mari, the girl he actually loved, he isolated and could barely take care of himself until Kel, in a naive attempt to help, pushed Hiro to an absolute emotional outburst. A moment that even shook him so much that he decided to force himself out of his slump. He forced himself to become a functional adult again, to be the one who takes care of others again, even though that might not at all have been something he was ready for. And with Mari, the one who supported his dreams of becoming a chef, gone for reasons he might never know, then he gave up on that dream and caved to the pressure of his parents, opting instead to become an engineer. The development of Aubrey is absolutely the most painful, because it is the polar opposite of Kel. Aubrey, the short-fused little kid, who we learn is actually from a broken home, who had no real family, except the one she thought she had found in her friends. She treasured everything that friendship gave her, especially the little sister-like relationship she got with Mari. But after the loss of her, everyone withdrew into themselves. The group fell apart. She was left to fend for herself. There is no doubt, Aubrey's bullying and lashing out crosses the line multiple times. But I honestly find it so hard to feel anything but sympathy For the girl who not only lost who she saw as her big sister, but for the girl who seemingly lost everything. I'm not a fan of the phrasing overcoming trauma. It has this implication that when we as human beings experience trauma, then it's as simple as like a Toyota on a family road trip, just hitting, a tiny pothole of life. Like, it's something where you just need to, get over it. Like, it just takes some time, sure, it might cause some problems, sure. But, in the end, the car will be fine, the trip and everything will be fine. Everyone, still gets to go to Disneyland. But trauma is often not something you really get over. Genuine trauma is often character-changingly painful. It has repercussions that will likely change the course of your life. And to bring back the absurd example with the Toyota, if said Toyota was Sonny and all his friends, and getting to Disneyland is their childhood dream of them all growing up together as one loving chosen family, then Mari dying isn't just some pothole in the road. It's Disneyland exploding. Everything they've dreamed of is suddenly impossible. And there's nothing anyone can do to fix it. All you can do in response to this kind of trauma is help someone process what happened. Face it. All the unfairness that comes with it. Our party's friend group will never be what it was. It's the truth that they've all been fighting on their own. And it's only at this moment where they're talking again, where they have each other again, when they're not alone, that they find the strength to, after all these years, take the first step towards fully accepting that even though life could have so easily been so different, then that's not how it turned out. And they have to live on in spite of that. There's this beautiful moment on the last day of the game when all this comes together, even though it's technically completely optional, where even though it's so painful, then you finally arrive here as friends, ready to visit Mari's grave together. It's a beautiful day. The flowers she brought look beautiful in the sunbeam. And then you sit and have picnic with Mari together one last time. If you've been paying attention, then you may have noticed that my assumption at the reveal of the loss of Mari, that this game had to be about a group of friends collectively getting over a terrible loss, has some Basil and Sonny shaped holes in them. Basil, throughout much of the daytime story, isn't actually there. Either he's emotionally distant, choosing to stay at home taking care of his plants and his grandma, or then he's very physically isolated from the group, locked in his room after he got pushed in the lake. And Sonny, while he might be physically present, then he never talks. His perspective is never mentioned. And while yes, his alter ego Omori also never talks, then his silent protagonism just feels off in the overworld, almost as if he's a mentally absent bystander. This generally odd and uncanny behavior from the both of them is noticeable even in the early parts of the game, but becomes very difficult to ignore the further you head in. Something appears. The first time I saw it was in Whitespace, in a red, creepy coloring book, located menacingly at the end of several blank pages. I genuinely thought this had to symbolize Sonny's guilt, a feeling not uncommon in this kind of situation, when someone you love so dearly and who you think you're so close to departs your life so suddenly in such a way. It's hard to not feel responsible. But at the end of the first day chapter, we learn that even though no one else does, then Basil sees it too. I couldn't explain this to myself. It became this mystery that kept nagging at me, like a tiny rock in my shoe. The game didn't remind me often, but it did it just enough to keep me aware of it. far enough into the game, it started stealing most of my attention. But after hours and hours and hours, that tiny little rock started to make me feel like I was losing my goddamn mind. You kept being able to see the back of the chair. Kind of ruined my green screen vibe. Omori is kind of a long game, but that's no surprise to no one. RPGs as video games are and always have been notoriously long, but that is why it is also going to sound like absolute heresy when I tell you that I think Omori, a just 21-hour game that I managed to beat in 16, is simply way too long. Now hold on, because I can hear you writing in the comments right now, and that's why I immediately want to point out that the physical amount of time I spent in this game is not the problem I have with it. You remember earlier in the video when I gave that kind of pointless seeming rundown of the things that happened in the first chapter of Headspace? I didn't do that because I had any particular problem with that chapter or any beef with Space Boyfriend. I did it because it helps illustrate a bigger problem with this game, one that I genuinely hoped was just a trait of a sort of rocky beginning, but somehow turned out to become even more apparent as the game went on. And that is that Omori's juggling between its two different worlds is executed in such a way that many of its chapters not only feel too long, but some of them feel like they don't even matter at all. To explain, when you properly get into the game, it doesn't take that long before you realize that the developers very much intended for the overworld and Headspace to be two separate experiences, not as much one intertwined story. And while I do think it's interesting to switch between these two stories that kind of go parallel to one another, then putting down this kind of hard wall between them creates a bunch of problems, such as favoritism. Headspace on its own is actually really fun to play. I love the art and just the general weirdness of it, and of course the quippy dialogue and the fighting is something that I do quite enjoy diving into. But the problem is, I like the daytime more. I fully acknowledge that this is a bias of mine, and I absolutely understand that there are players out there who would very much appreciate the longer breaks in between the really hard reality parts. But for some reason, and I don't know if it's because I'm a masochist, but the overworld is my cup of trauma tea, served just the way I like it. And this unfortunately has the effects that Headspace becomes something I need to get through in order to get more daytime. Another very different problem that comes up with this kind of world separation is that just because the developers want them to be separate doesn't mean I see them that way. As soon as I learned what Headspace really was, how it's actually Sunny's really unhealthy coping mechanism, then I struggled to forget that. I try to disassociate myself from this knowledge. I really try to focus on just kicking Royal Turnip butt and having fun with it while being in Headspace, but I just couldn't help but stop and think. Why do I care about the stakes of rescuing a fantasy hero from a fantasy princess at a fantasy wedding in a fantasy land, when the game has literally pointed out to me that there are much more serious and dire stakes out there? That Mari is gone and that Sunny needs his friends as much as they need him. It's something that, coupled with the game's overall problems with pacing, didn't just make Headspace feel like this slight chore, but so much so that it became kind of questionable. Which leads me to my last problem. The one I mentioned before this entire rant. The tiny rock in my shoe. The mystery of Sunny and Basil. I absolutely loved this mystery. What is actually happening between these two characters is one of the only story points that crosses into both the overworld and Headspace, even though neither focus on it at first. This gives the mystery sort of an invasive feeling, like it's overtaking the narrative, slowly eclipsing anything that's going on, until it reaches a point where you don't care about anything else. And I will say that build-up fully worked on me, chasing this mystery, trying to uncover it and figure out what was going on, became my obsession, but problematically so. Because caring so much about this mystery meant that my patience started growing very thin with anything not related to it. And surprisingly, even in the latest parts of the game, it still had a lot of not mystery related to show me. The last night of Headspace takes place underwater, in a shark-run casino called The Last Resort, and inside a whale called Humphrey. And while everything here was honestly still very good quality, like the gameplay was as good as ever and the dialogue was still quippy and fun, then playing through these last 2 chapters made me not just find Omocat's decision-making as a developer questionable, but freaking baffling. I genuinely believe that the developers must have never taken a single glance at a 4th grade story structure graph, because instead of the story of the overworld and Headspace slowly wrapping up together as the mystery of Sunny and Basil finally fully takes the helm, then Headspace shoots off somewhere, grinding against every bit of built tension by getting longer every single chapter. I genuinely thought that the game was coming to an end by the beginning of Night 3. Not because of the hours I'd put in, but because the teasing of the underlying mystery had already gotten very exhausting at this point, and because the game seemed to give off these indicators that there was not much more story left. Okay, pause. I actually wanted to take a break in my angry rant, because I do feel that I heavily understated how much I love this specific part. This intro to Night 3 with just Omori and Mari is one of my absolute favorite moments in the game. I am not a very spiritual person, so I do believe that the ghost we see of Mari is not actually her true spirit, but just Sunny's projections of her. However, I only think this adds to the beauty and the tragedy somewhat. Beauty because it would mean Sunny still relies on the part of him that knows his sister to find that belief in himself when every other part of him seemingly has given up. And tragedy because it is just a hope of how Mari would act. When people pass, we can put trust in our ideas of them, that they would definitely forgive us and love us, support us and be there for us if they could. But the thing about those who are gone is that we can just never truly feel and know that for certain. Basically, then I think this could have made an incredibly strong and meaningful ending to the main parts of Headspace, considering the character-defining confrontation that Sunny has lying ahead of him. However, then the game had the audacity to clap not 1, not 2, but like 4 or 5 extra hours of Headspace on the end of it. Don't get me wrong, I could handle Last Resort. I could accept it, because then this night would only be about as long as the last one. But Humphrey is yet another enormous area you have to beat in the same night, where you spend multiple hours fighting a whale, fighting some slime ladies that I don't really remember anything about except the fact that they got my video demonetized like 4 times. They do experiments on the turnips and you have to defeat the whale to get out of the whale. I genuinely don't really remember. Because while I could accept The Last Resort as this final break on the edge before the finale, then Humphrey just felt like such a slap to the face, completely screwing the emotional pacing, not just by being way too long, but by even being there in the first place. Which apparently Omocat knows, as it was during my 6th time doing one of these puzzles that I looked up a walkthrough on the Wikipedia and found out that Omocat doesn't even like this part, and heavily considered giving the player dynamite as a solution to just blow right past it. This was the last straw. It was actually by noticing this little comment at the bottom of an Omori trivia page that I finally got curious enough about these odd developer decisions, this odd need to keep feeding us Headspace content that they know is problematic, that I resorted to diving into Omori's history, to see if maybe going into a bit of the past could give some sort of reasonable explanation or answer. To which it actually could. You don't even have to go that far back to discover that the fact this game even came out is kind of a miracle, since it was a title that was infamously delayed by not 1, not 2 years, but 5 years. A massive delay time for pretty much any game, but a near unthinkable amount of time for an RPG Maker title. If you want to learn more about how on earth this happened, then there's a great video by Uricksaladbar that goes into detail describing this development hell in full. But to make it short, then Omori was an extremely well-funded indie campaign made by a passionate but way too inexperienced developer. One who made many mistakes, but the absolute biggest being underestimating the Herculean task of making a video game. Omori put in huge promises for what this game was gonna be, stating it would contain a whole 8 dungeons and tons of side quests and NPCs. An incredible bang for buck selling point when all you need to do is raise money, but also goals that could be heavily creatively restrictive if the game were to go through major changes, which of course it did. Omori started as a typical dream-themed Earthbound clone, and then turned into a true passion project with an excellent story, but a story that is simply incompatible with its Kickstarter promises, too thin to spread over 20+ hours worth of content. Now, the right solution to this problem would probably have been to cut content and focus on quality instead of quantity. But unfortunately, after 5 years of delays, and after 5 years of some of the most dog food quality community outreach I've ever seen, then the Kickstarter backers were on the verge of collectively suing the company. And failing to meet some of those described Kickstarter promises was simply too big of a risk to take. Which all culminates in this kind of cold, but very clear and cut explanation as to why Headspace, the most creatively flexible part of Omori, is so enormous, but in a way that feels so bloated and sometimes so pointless. Now, if you've watched this far into the video, and you happen to be a really big fan of Omori, and now also someone who's had to listen to what I think the game does wrong for the last 20 minutes, then I know you must be thinking, but what about the ending? The ending of Omori is something that I have intentionally not mentioned yet, for reasons that will become very apparent very soon. But basically, then Omori's ending is, for better or worse, a game changer. The kind where even if many critics do hold firm on their complaints, then I've also seen almost as many change their mind after these last 2 insane hours. So without much further ado, accept an enormous spoiler and content warning. Then let's dive into it. Let's take a proper look at Omori's ending, my personal experience with it, and see if it, as some people claim, was all worth it. Once I had played far enough into Headspace and finally wrapped up my trench war with Humphrey, I was met by a dark, dim, watery hallway with a giant window at the end of it, very much like the one we saw Mari walk into in the beginning of the dream. And as I approached it, I would hear the words, "Collect all the keys." Words that I know were supposed to just be a hint, but almost seemed like an ultimatum to not just me, but Sunny as well, warning us that collecting these keys will lead to suffering, but that if we didn't face said suffering, we would not be able to continue. Also, by keys, the voice is referring to literal keyboard keys, by the way, that you need in order to fill out a hangman puzzle that you've actually had in your inventory this entire time. So if you didn't do that along the way, or you kinda just forgot to do that or didn't think it was important, well, then you gotta go do that. Kind of salt in the wound, considering the time waste I just discussed. But regardless, once we finish the puzzle, it will menacingly spell out, "Welcome to Black Space," before we see a dark hole form in the place that we first lost Basil. This is the game's last point of no return before the endgame. The last chance you would get to explore more of Headspace if that's what you want to do for some reason. Because taking the plunge into this deep dark abyss means diving into Sonny's deeper unconscious. the place where memories go to die, the black space. Upon watching Sunny wash up on these ashy grey beaches and being met by numerous dark collage-style doors, each hiding a different nightmare world behind it, I fully realized that we had transitioned away from the fun RPG world and now into a full-on Yume Nikki nightmare. Yume Nikki is an old but influential RPG Maker game about a girl who's also described as a hikik omori, the Japanese word for someone suffering from immense social withdrawal. A girl who spends all her time just sleeping and exploring her bizarre dream worlds. And while it is obvious at several points that Omori has taken a lot of inspiration from this game, then both in terms of premise and visuals, then the black space almost seems like a direct callback to it. However, where Yume Nikki's dream worlds almost seem like these abstract horror canvases with indirect and vague meanings, then Omori's black space to me felt like a broken record, a bit-crushed hell that keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. The pain that Sunny feels in regards to the loss of his sister. In fact, the most important thing, the biggest thing about black space is that this is where we finally find Basil. After all this time, he's just been waiting here. You'd think that our reunion would be an incredibly cheerful one, but it isn't, because we actually don't just find him once. We find him a dozen times, spread throughout these different worlds, and we find him only to watch him get torn apart or eliminated in one way or another. It is hard to watch. And as a player, I never even get the option to try to save him. One of the final rooms is this church, where Basil is inside, almost like he's crucified at the top of this altar just begging for help. After all this time of just watching, I finally get the option to try to save him. But then Omori follows, and we see him walk through a sea of red, littered with other Basils. The cruel hands of black space are restraining Basil, and as he a final time pleads out for help, pleads out for his friend, Omori stabs him and walks over him as he finally takes his place on a throne of crimson red. This final scene, this full showcase of power, fully reveals why Basil was never in that dream. It's because Basil's existence, for whatever reason, is dangerous to Sunny. And so his unconscious trauma defense on complete overdrive and its personification, Omori, will do anything it can to protect him, even if it means making him forget about Basil entirely. This is what Sunny is up against. This is how unhealthy his coping mechanism has become after years and years of relying on it. It is not sustainable, and something has to change. And Sunny knows this. After waking up from black space, it is now the third and final day. This idea of hope, but also desperation, kinda seems to replay itself throughout the entire day. This is where Sunny truly finds and reconnects with his old friends, and watching them take that very first step gives him courage he hasn't known in years. In the evening, the gang all go to Basil's house, Aubrey desperately wanting to apologize to Basil for pushing him in the lake, but he refuses to answer. He's suffering, and deep down, Sunny knows this, but he has yet to know why. It is the last day, the last chance for Sunny to save his friend, but also himself. Waking up in white space again, I noticed that this time I was playing as Sunny, since Omori is still sitting under the light bulb of headspace, the light and the illusion that I finally get the option to break. The room goes dark, and we finally have a head-to-head encounter with the one fear that Sunny has been unable to overcome. Something It throws every terrible memory and anxiety at us. Sonny has to brave through it, breathing deeply. But it slowly becomes clear that there is actually a chance. A chance that Sonny could finally learn the missing pieces. Even if it is knowledge that he himself has suppressed for years, then seeing this through might just be possible. It's nonchalant, but walking into the light, we're met with a bright green path and a heaven-like gate lying open before us, just with a single grey photograph of a tree. We walk up to Basil. He says not much of importance, really. He just asks for forgiveness before handing you a black photo album where, like before, then it's up to us to fill in the missing pieces. He steps out of our way. This photo, it's one of those images where it takes entire moments to even realize what you might be looking at. Like an actual photo found lying in the dust, it seemed too unimportant. The ambience just kept rolling in uninterrupted, sleeping drones. This couldn't be what I was looking for. Whatever I saw had to be missing context, or a misunderstanding on my part. I had to find something else to tell me what actually happened. But as the pictures accumulated in the photo album, I started to realize there was no different truth forming. And as I dove further into the hellscape of many bodies, many dying bodies, peering down an endless seeming flight of stairs, the music awakening into remina, shifting into a discordant piano key playing, escalating, I could feel it taunting me, having tricked me into believing the truth had to be different from the terrible suspicions I felt in my gut when I saw that picture. But of course, it wasn't. The two siblings were fighting about the upcoming recital. In a moment of anger, Sonny pushed, accidentally killing his sister. Basil saw it, but refusing to believe it, he tried to help. He tried to fix it. And their horrible actions, reflected in a single terrifying visual, would haunt and ruin the lives of them both. I felt manipulated. I had so much time with these characters. I felt I knew them. I cared for them. I trusted them. And so I had already decided that they had to be victims of a cruel world that happened to them. I refused to believe what I was being told, choosing to hold on to strands of hope that I must be seeing wrong, until the full evidence was forced in front of me. And what made all this so horrifying is that how they acted isn't something completely in the realm of fantasy. I was 21 years old at the time, sitting playing a video game, but even I couldn't confront what I was seeing. Basil and Sonny were just 12 years old, and what do stupid kids do? In panic and desperation, when the only solution out of bad options is to confront the incomprehensible situation they're in. They can't do it. Okay, this isn't actually what happens. The game doesn't just end here. I mean, Jesus Christ, imagine. But after Sonny and Basil beat each other so badly that Sonny ends up losing his eye and the both of them slip into unconsciousness, then we wake up in yet another dream. But this one is different from anything we've played before. There's warm colors. It looks like Sonny's hometown, and Basil is even here with us. And it's here in his monologue to Sonny that we slowly realize just how little we actually have learned about him so far. Since he was disappeared from the dream world and distant in real life, then it's only now where Sonny's memories are fully intact that we're able to learn of the close friendship that they had. Basil saw Sonny kill Mari, but simply refusing a reality where his dear friend would be capable of something like that, then he fell into the delusion that he must have been framed, and he desperately and naively tried to help him, and he did this no matter what, no matter if his friends left him, no matter if he was alone, no matter if he was bullied, and it was only that final thought that Sonny would be moving town and leaving him forever to carry that finally managed to push him beyond the edge. He sends Sonny away with the hope that he will open up to his friends, that he will look into the memories behind those photos and remember that bond that they shared. And as we take one last walk up to Recital Hall, we do exactly that. We rediscover the memories that he and his friends had together, the real stories that Omori had repressed and replaced. We see their cute interactions as they spit watermelon on each other, as they cheat at cards and lie in each other's laps while dreaming about the distant future. And we get these wonderful insights into how things came to be, such as Aubrey's hair, which wasn't a spiral into her delinquency, but a simple promise that she had made with Mari to do one day. And we also get to see them all celebrating Christmas under one roof together, where Sonny's friends have collectively saved up money to buy him his beloved violin. And as he enters the building, he's met by the people who've been with him this entire time. Aubrey, Kel, and Hiro, who finally tell him the true meaning behind those memories. That he should trust their friendship, trust that it will be able to handle even the strain of this truth, and that they will be able to forgive him one day, but that it is ultimately up to him, because even with the support of his friends, then Sonny still has to make up his own judgment. He has to decide for himself if he is an irredeemable monster, or if he is a person who deserves a chance at redemption. The fight with Omori is not mechanically difficult, but it is one of the hardest fights I've ever played through. Now that Sonny knows the truth, Omori can't protect him from it anymore, so there is no choice left but to erase Sonny entirely. All we can do in this fight is breathe and reflect. Think about the kind words of Sonny's friends. Words that technically aren't even real, but just a faint hope of what they might say. Imaginary support from people Sonny can do nothing but truly hope will one day be able to forgive him. Omori starts just screaming, berating Sonny, embodying all the hate and the guilt that he feels for himself. And worst is, from the perspective of the player, then we understand some of it. When Omori roared that Sonny isn't the person his friends know anymore, I couldn't help but remember my own sense of betrayal, my belief in Sonny, and how I thought he could never do something like this. The lone violin gets swallowed up by discordant noise as the music morphs into something nightmarish. Alter is perhaps one of the most catastrophic pieces of music I've ever heard. The crushed, looping sounds of their fight, the piercing noise as she screams, crashing down the stairs. Sonny did something irreversible. He did cause so much pain for all the people that he loves. Their lives will never be the same, and he did keep it a secret. He did do everything to protect himself. The evidence of his terrible actions keep violently flashing at us. The screams, the sight of her. It all just becomes too much. Duet in its entirety is a moment I can only say explains itself. Sunny has chosen to live, and while he will never hear Mori's direct forgiveness, then he knows in his heart she would want him to live on. And so in this beautiful scene, he cherishes everything he had with her. Every moment they've loved living together. The person she was, faintly by his side, they play together one last time. Before Sunny finally takes his first step towards the rest of his life. This is Omori's ending. And it's odd, because so far I've been able to form pretty one-sided opinions of most chapters of this game. And yet this ending makes me feel very conflicted with myself. I guess if I had to be annoying, I could start off by talking about this through my typical old reliable critical lens, because then I could say that we see various problems start to pop up before we even reach the ending proper. Blackspace's cutscene of Sunny falling into Blackspace, as cool of an intro to the endgame as it is a weak way to wrap up the tens of hours of overworld headspace that we've just played through. The only thing that happens after Humphrey is defeated is that we get a few cryptic hints from a window about some kind of scavenger hunt. We go pick up some keys in places we've already been, and then with no real narrative fanfare, headspace kind of just comes to an end. And unfortunately, it also ended up affecting how I viewed Blackspace. Because no matter how much I tried to connect with it, no matter how many videos I watched after of the various different creative meanings that Blackspace could have, then I just couldn't shake this feeling that the developers might value Blackspace more as a convenient rescue from their writing problem with Headspace than as a genuinely artistic way to try to tell a story. After all, why actually write this mess together and confront the emotional and tonal differences that you've created between Headspace and the main story, when you can just drop the players into the vagueness of Blackspace, a place that without words compensates for this lacking mention of any story connections by being literally flooded with them, and that with minimal time and effort can try to set the mood so the player is nice and ready for the ending. Speaking of the actual ending, then its execution is haunted by the same problems that have plagued this entire game, pacing problems, but this time it's a completely different beast. In an analysis of Omori, game reviewer Shetani talks about 3-act story structures in games. How many stories consist of 3 acts: setup, confrontation, and resolution, and how a writer's ability to balance those is key to good pacing. But in the case of Omori's main story, then 19 of its 21-hour playtime is essentially just setup, splitting the last 2 between confrontation and resolution. So what does this really tell us? Well, it basically explains why the ending feels so absolutely insane to play. The story out of nowhere starts just running on rails, and we're taking in so much more everything than we're used to. As if Omori had given up this juggling act between being a story RPG and a JRPG, and had finally committed to the former. And weirdly, this is actually my biggest problem, because compared to everything we just played, then this complete change in pacing, this overwhelming 2-hour experience doesn't just stand out as unique or a bit weird. It frankly stands out as a bit suspicious. When I now combine everything I know about the development of Omori, the kind of pressure they were under to make more content even though they were pushed half a decade, then my guess is that if they didn't know the entire time, then they did eventually realize the kind of fundamental problems that the game has. They did eventually learn that bloating the game and making Headspace so story isolated was a bad call. And I'm also guessing, but this really is a far-fetched guess of mine, only based on what I know of Omocat's reputation as a naive but very passionate developer, then I'm guessing that they were willing to stick to the current strategy and putting the player through excruciating build-up and giving them incredible expectations because they simply had faith that the ending would be a strong enough payoff to make most players hopefully forget, or at least forgive, the problems leading up to it. And it's one of those crazy gambles that you would only ever see being made by someone who has an incredibly passionate view of their own project, and something that 9 out of 10 you usually don't get graciously away with doing. And it's why I was so surprised that in the case of Omori, then the developers might actually have been onto something. I've talked about this game from my critical perspective now, trying to remain somewhat emotionally distanced from it. But if I were to just purely and selfishly talk about my own experiences and my own feelings when it comes to this ending, well, then Omori's ending was one of the few times in my life where I was so invested in a game that I felt personally exposed. It was the kind of experience where even if I do have my complaints, and I could never in my right mind call Omori a masterpiece, then I will always call it one of my personal favorites. After the horrible reveal, the nightmare of Alter, and the pure crying relief of Duet, then the game simply ends with Sonny standing in the doorway of Basil's hospital room, where he is finally ready to share the truth of what happened to Mari. It's a scene that left me completely in his shoes, feeling so very nervous and uncertain about what could possibly happen from now on, but also knowing somewhere that this is for the best. By accidentally getting the secret ending, I did manage to get a little more closure, as I got to see Sonny waking up Basil, with both their somethings fading away behind them. But even though the scene shows that they're not bearing the weight of the secret anymore, then the reactions of their friends and the future consequences of their actions is forever uncertain. And honestly, I like that. Omori is not a story about beating or conquering trauma, but a story showing just how underestimatedly difficult it can be to even take those very first steps of just accepting what happened and choosing to talk about it. Showing Sonny's friends being there for him, helping him heal regardless of what he's done, would definitely make for a more closure-giving ending, a neat story wrapped in a bow. But that's also all it would be. Because while opening up is essential to process trauma, then the idea that opening up will always go well and will always be a good experience simply doesn't reflect reality. It actually takes strength, because opening up to the wrong person or the wrong crowd about something as intimate and difficult to talk about as trauma, even as a victim, someone easy to sympathize with, still bears the risk of consequences like social ostracizing or labeling. And, well, if you happen to be in an even more morally nuanced position, then building the strength to love oneself enough to open up to someone can seem almost impossible. The fact that in Omori, we don't follow the perspective of a pure victim, but someone as divisive and controversial as Sunny is the single boldest decision that this game has made with its storytelling. And the fact that even in these awful worst case circumstances, then this character is still approached with empathy is the main reason why I bawled my eyes out at the end of this game. Because I genuinely thought Sunny was doomed. To talk about why this is, then I feel it makes sense to share a bit of context from my own life and who I happen to be. Because I'm a person who has always, for reasons that I don't know, been terrified at the idea of risk. I know this is gonna sound absolutely ridiculous, but the very idea that anything I do has a not 0% chance to cause someone harm or distress, that I could essentially become an awful, terrible human being in an instant, is a hyper-obsession of mine that I don't know if I can be rid of. I do have good times, long stretches where I feel like my brain doesn't fall into those paranoid habits as easily, and where I feel like medication and treatment is actually doing some work. But I do also have bad times, where the worst case scenarios in everything I do is so vividly shown in my mind that the anxiety just makes it seem like even the smallest risk of disaster is an inevitability. That there will be a day where even my overthinking brain won't be able to plan for a situation. I will fail a calculation and I will make a mistake where I am going to be the reason that someone ends up in a really bad way. Now, to make the connection a little easy here, then with these things in mind, one could definitely argue that Omori might be the single worst game that I could have possibly played. It is a game where the entire plot twist is that a singly badly timed shove has terrible, deadly consequences. And it's a game that I realized after looking back at some of the gameplay even demonstrates how easily a nightmare like this could occur. How many of us get to live the daily lives that we do because we barely dodge steep, horrible consequences without even really thinking about it. Omori's story is my nightmare, and it is why I reacted to the entire ending the way that I did, because I really didn't want to watch Sunny make what I kind of thought was an inevitable decision, because it's what I would have done. I would have judged myself as someone irredeemable, and as someone who simply didn't deserve to be able to go on. But thankfully, that's not how the game ends, at least in any way I care. It ends in duet, a scene of just pure empathy. And I remember just feeling like this weight had come off my shoulders as I just started sobbing through this ending. Up until now, Sunny's situation had been everything I feared. An incredibly unlikely but still terrifyingly possible scenario. And the game doesn't coddle you about the kind of consequences that he could be facing for what he's done. He might be punished, he might be ostracized, his friends might leave him. And honestly, his fight with Omori might just be the first mental battle of many he's gonna have down the road. But Duet ultimately shows that even in an absolute horror show like this, the kind most of us wouldn't even know how to react to ourselves, the kind I basically gave up living to avoid at all costs, even in a situation like that, then Sunny is not an irredeemable monster, lost beyond all hope. And neither would I be. Holy, I'm sweating. Who would have thought staying under stage lights for all this time would be that hot, huh? I don't know. Wouldn't be me. Omori is a really funny game though, because even though I love this game and hold it dearly in my heart, then I am certain it is not for the same reason that anyone else loves this game. And that's the thing, there are so many stories, messages, and perspectives that might be somewhat agreed upon in the community. But the truth is that Omori is simply so big and such a weird compromise that kind of clumsily attracts so many different niches of people to play it, that there really is no definitive experience of what playing Omori feels like. And anyone who does play it will likely come out on the other side with their own completely unique perspective. This video, however, only does cover mine. It is why I have not mentioned large parts of this game that others might consider important, things like the combat mechanics and the other endings and routes, simply because they didn't really matter much when it comes to what ultimately made Omori such a weird, unique, and special experience to me. Now don't get me wrong, I have researched this game for months now, and I would love nothing more than to sit here and rant at lengths about how I think the other endings are kinda garbage, how weird or crazy what the frick values are, and also what the frick 143 means, how I would love to tell Omori fans to their face that just cause it makes sense for Sunny's character and probably his diagnosis, then it doesn't make it engaging storytelling to make Headspace pointless and 20 hours long, and how the people who actually bought the something plush to the point that it is now sold out might actually need a lengthy therapeutic discussion about why they did that. Like, seriously, what's wrong with you? Did we play the same game? We saw the same thing? No? Why'd you buy that? However, this video has already become the most ambitious and probably messy project that I've ever taken on, becoming much longer and much more convoluted than I could have ever feared. I truly hope that any of you who are still left watching at this point in time got something out of my weird and messy rant. And that maybe, just maybe, hopefully, I got to do this game a little bit of justice. Not just analyzing it and talking about its faults and what games that come after it could do better than it, but also just thanking the developers of this game for the bold direction they decided to take with this story. How it feels ridiculous to say, but it genuinely changed my perspective of myself in a way I am much happier about. And that I truly hope that there will be many games down the line throughout the years that will take inspiration from Omori and Omocat's work and pursue telling those so very difficult and painful, yet so very important stories. Thank you all so much for watching, and I catch you all in the next one. Peace.